the past, I think it's always been win-lose. It's either been like lose for humans or lose for the environment. And I think we're now in this kind of unique position where I can see a future where it actually is win-win. It just, needs us to like get a move on and put it into action.
Big environmental issues like climate change and plastic pollution and deforestation are all huge hot topics these days, pardon the pun. My guest today is someone who seeks to cut through all the noise and hyperbole by simply presenting the information about our world as accurately as possible. Because today I'm speaking to Hannah Ritchie, the lead researcher and deputy editor of Our World in Data, one of the internet's most popular data science providers that aims to not only collate the best research possible, but crucially, to provide it in user-friendly interfaces that make that research available and understandable for everyone. So chances are you've actually seen one of their graphs before. Like if you spent any time online trying to understand COVID data during the height of the pandemic, you've probably seen their stuff because they were one of the leaders in providing COVID-related data. And given Hannah's expertise, specifically in environmental science, this conversation largely focuses on our environment. And I'm also pleased to say that this conversation is therefore not all doom and gloom. In fact, much of Hannah's work focuses on the progresses we've made that the mainstream media are failing to tell us, which I suspect is in part why she chose to write and name her brand new book that's just come out called Not the End of the World. So on that note, here's my conversation with Hannah Ritchie and how we can find win-win solutions to Earth's many issues so that we can unlock a truly sustainable and flourishing future. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. I've just finished your book, which is incredible. Like really, really just so much information condensed and presented so beautifully. And one of the first statements, one of the main statements that you make that I think is in many ways quite surprising is that human beings have never been sustainable in the way that we would understand it. So could you explain what that means?
Yeah, so I think when I think about sustainability, I'm from an environmental background, and I think when most of us think about sustainability, we think about it through this very environmental lens of sustainable is having a low environmental impact to protect future generations and their opportunities, and then I'd include like other species on the planet and that as well. So it's really much based around these environmental impacts. Now you can see when you use that definition, like it's very clear we're really not in a sustainable place, and you might argue that in the past our ancestors were very sustainable, right? Like they had a low environmental impact. I think what that misses is like, to me, and this is a kind of standard definition of sustainable development, is there's another half to that, which is that we also need to provide a good life for everyone that's on Earth today. And actually that really gives sustainability there like two halves. And kind of what I argue is that we've never really been sustainable because we've never achieved both halves at the same time, right? Like our ancestors might have had a low environmental impact, but often, kind of standard human well-being metrics like child mortality or maternal mortality or life expectancy were really poor. So there was always this trade-off between one or the other. And kind of what we've seen over the last few centuries is that balance has shifted in the other direction, right? So human well-being metrics have massively improved, but it's largely come at the cost of the environment, right? We burn fossil fuels for energy, we've expanded farmlands and cut down forests. So it's shifted in the other direction. And that's why I kind of put forward, we've actually never really achieved sustainability yet, even though in our heads we think, the past was really sustainable. And only recently have we kind of tipped out of sustainability.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about, dig into this idea of the trade-off and whether it's, as the way you describe it, if we manage to balance both sides of this equation, then and only then will be sustainable. And that, by definition, would be like the most win-win thing, because you're basically eradicating a trade-off and just turning it into this purely like positive sum possibility. With regards to this idea of like the past, because as you mentioned, like we sort of have this almost romanticized idea of prehistoric or in like at least early life prior to the agricultural revolution. But even that, we a lot of people think that they had no negative impact on the environment, but even that's not true, right? Because large mammals were hunted, many large mammals were hunted to extinction by hunter-gatherers. So that aspect wasn't even truly sustainable. You mentioned that back then, the life expectancies and child mortality were bad. What kind of numbers are we talking about here?
Yeah, so we can look kind of historically. We kind of, the best records are for kind of historical societies like over the last few centuries, but we can take kind of measurements from further back in time, and actually you can take measurements from some hunter-gatherer tribes today, or looking back in history. And like there, you're talking about rates of around half. Like it was often you were talking about a toin costs, whether a child would survive to puberty or not. Mm-hmm. And we've seen massive reductions since then. So today, like the under 5 child mortality rate is now less than 5%, whereas a few centuries ago, you would have been looking at, 40+%. So globally, we've seen really, really massive reductions in child mortality.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other more counterintuitive facts of progress that people might not be aware of?
I think most of the human well-being metrics have gone in a positive direction. Actually, I think this is the inverse of what many people imagine, right? Like in the book, I kind of, one of the key turning points for me, and as I highlight in the book, it was discovering the work of Hans Rosling. And he was a Swedish statistician, and he would do these amazing TED Talks where he'd kind of show how the world has changed over the last few centuries. But his kind of like party trick was showing that many of our like conceptions about the world were like almost the inverse. So like if you ask people, has extreme poverty gone up or down globally? People will say it's gone up, and actually it's gone down. And I think this is true across many, many of these metrics. So people massively underestimate how many girls in the world are in school, and it's nearly all of them. What percentage of kids get vaccinated? We think it's a really low percentage because most of low income countries, vaccination isn't happening there, and it is happening there. Another surprising one for me, like from an environmental background, and again, I would have drawn this in completely the wrong direction, is that you look at deaths from disasters over the last century, with climate change and with increasing risk there, you would assume that they would be going up.
Right.
But actually, they've massively gone down because societies are much more resilient to disasters than they were in the past. So I think there's like, most of the stuff we imagine has been getting worse has actually been getting better when you step back to look at the data.
So why do you think there is such a big gap in perception, essentially, of what is, this positive good news, of the progress we've been making, and people's internal perceptions?
I think there are a couple of roles there. I think the media plays a strong role, right? The media is basically there to show you like what's the worst thing that's happened in the world today. And when you see a disaster, and when you see disaster after disaster after disaster, your intuition there is, of course, this is obviously getting worse, and the number of deaths from disasters are rising, right? When you see a report on, child hunger, you assume, obviously this is way, way worse than it was in the past. So like the news is there to basically give us single stories and single events, and this often brings us into the kind of negativity bias. Then the most of the specific events that you see are negative. What you don't see is the gradual positive changes that happen day after day after day after day. Now, these are actually really massive. When you look at the numbers, I think my colleague Max Rosa calculated a statistic that over the last 15 or 20 years, you could have ran the headline basically every single day that around 130,000 people escaped extreme poverty. And that's just happened day after day after day after day. But it's not an event, right? Because it's not it's not eye-catching and it's happening over and over again. But this is the stuff that we just don't see. So we tend to see the negative because they're splashy headlines and splashy events, but we don't see the underlying positive trends that, over decades have completely reshaped the world that we live in.
What role did this perception gap play in you deciding to become one of the head researcher at Our World in Data? Because you have a really interesting story, and perhaps you could share it, of how you went from being you've been an environmentalist, but in some ways you had a pivot in terms of the way that you perceive your role as an environmentalist. So could you just sort of talk us through how you went from that to becoming head researcher at Our World in Data, and also what Our World in Data is really trying to do?
Yeah, so I can start with the latter. So I work for a project called Our World in Data, and we're a bunch of researchers at Oxford University, and we also have a non-profit, because the kind of tech development and data analyst's role is really important in our work as well. But we're basically a website, so you can go on ourown.data.org. And what I see our role is sitting in this gap between research and data, and then the people that will actually use that to drive change, whether that's journalists, policymakers, innovators, other researchers that would then use this data and research to actually make change in the world. I think what we see is this massive gap where a lot of the research and answers that people need to fundamental questions are there. They're just locked in academic papers or like some spreadsheet on someone's hard drive that no one ever sees. So what our data we want to do is to bring that data and research out into the world in a language that people can understand. They can explore the data, they can understand how the world's changing, and hopefully work on solutions to what we frame as the kind of world's largest problems. But how I got into this is my background is environmental science. That's what I studied at university over years. And even prior to that, like as a kid, I was just like really obsessed with the environment, and that was kind of what I wanted to do with my life. But I think by the end of my environmental degree or degrees, because I have multiple, I felt just so helpless about the state of the world. Like when you just look at all of the environmental trends, they've just got worse and worse and worse. And I think to me, it kind of ended up in this kind of paralyzed state where I felt like there's nothing really here I can do to contribute because these problems will just get worse and there's really no clear turning point for me. But I think the issue there is that I was looking at these environmental trends were getting worse. And I also was extrapolating that, as most of us do, to assume that human well-being metrics were also getting worse. That's why the work of Hans Rosling was so pivotal. Like I saw his work and I realized, many of the misconceptions I had about the world are really upside down. And I could only see that by stepping back to look at the data. So that's what started to get me involved in maybe by using data, I can see these problems in a fundamentally different way, in a more progressive way that leads me more towards solutions than the state that I was in. So I think since then, I've gone through a gradual process over the last 7 or 8 years at our own data of studying these environmental problems and starting now to see them in a slightly different light than I did a decade ago.
There's this kind of vibe around the environmental movement that we are doomed, or that everything unfolding is a giant tragedy, and it gives almost a sense of just paralysis and doom. I also sort of went through that kind of arc as well, because it is tragic what is going on. That's not to diminish. There's so much that, I'm so sad at the amount of deforestation going on in the Amazon and the plastics going everywhere and so on. But I guess what is your main critique with the environmental movement, and what would you like to see it do differently?
I think the balance I find really difficult, and actually what I've tried to straddle a bit in the book, is this pushing back a bit on the complete doomsday scenarios, which comes through and the doomsday scenarios is not, this is a big problem, this is really serious, because that's what I believe. The doomsday scenarios is, it's too late for us to do anything about this. There's really no way that we can turn this around. And that's not a useful message if we want to implement solutions. That does lead us into this kind of paralysis and inaction. And even people that might be kind of on the fringe and being willing to engage in environmentalism or environmental solutions, when they hear that message, it really, really puts them off. So I think that was one of my kind of fundamental critiques, is this just extrapolation to, not just going from this is really serious and we need to get a move on to this, it's too late and there's nothing we can do about it, which I think is often the message that's coming through. But I also recognize that there is also a risk on the other side of complacency. I think it can be misinterpreted as if you're not doing the really doomsday scenarios, then you're not taking the problem seriously enough and you're not driving the action that we need. And you're lulling people into a sense of false security and false complacency. So I think that's the really hard thing to straddle. I think my overall main critique, I think, with how we talk about the environment at the moment is we always talk problem, right? We just want to point out the problem over and over and over. And for many of these problems, we all know what the problem is. It's about solutions. How do we move that level of engagement, which is very high? If you look at surveys across the world on, do you believe in climate change? Do you think government should act on climate change? Do you think companies, individuals should act? most people, like really high percentage, says yes. So they're engaged. It's how you then translate that into action. And I don't see us translating it into action by just repeating the problem over and over. You have to then start to talk about solutions, and really practical solutions that will actually work.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, I want to spend a large chunk of this conversation talking about those solutions. Prior to that, though, I'd like to also dig into, as you mentioned, the role of the media, because one of the cool things you do in a lot of the chapters of your book is you give examples of where the media have run with headlines that are just completely false, or at least based on a tiny snippet of information and completely decontextualized. Some of my favorite examples is like this one of we only have 60 harvests left with regards to like soil degradation. Where does that one come from, do you think? Where did like that, because that's just categorically false, right?
Yeah, it's completely false. And if you ask soil scientists, what do you think about this claim? Like, they laugh, because the notion that the world's soils are all going to just stop working at the same time, and that time is going to be in 60 years, just like nonsense, right? Like, the world's soils are so heterogeneous, and that's not to undermine the fact that soil degradation is going on, because in the book I like quote studies showing, yes, soil degradation is a problem, but it's not happening everywhere, and it's not happening at the same rate everywhere. So the notion that just soils stop working after 60 years everywhere in the world is just like nonsense. And yeah, I went on a kind of wild goose chase to try and find out where it came from. And other researchers have done this as well. I think James Wong at the New Scientist, he's a botanist, and he also tried to do the same. And it seems to kind of lead back to, someone at a UN conference said it in a conference speech, but they never came forward to actually back that up. And it's just been repeated over and over, right? But once it makes it into the media, it just becomes a loop where just everyone now buys into this. There's only 60 harvests left. I think there are now actually some books called 60 Harvests Left, like based on this whole premise. And actually, when you try to trace it back to the roots, there's got really no scientific basis to it.
Yeah, another one is that there will be more plastics in the sea in 2050 than fish. And that one I had heard. I hadn't actually heard the 60 Harvests Left one, but like again, if you run the numbers, there's it's going to be nowhere close to that. But at the same time, it doesn't. I guess my question is there any value in over dramatizing the extent of a problem in order to get people caring about it? Have there been instances where you were like, okay, this isn't strictly true, but this has galvanized such a movement that, so like take for example, I'm not giving this an example of actually a good outcome, but like when there was that image of the turtle with the plastic straw up its nose, that got people thinking about ocean trash in a way that they hadn't before. The unfortunate outcome was that they then thought that the way to solve this was to ban plastic straws, as opposed to just like, even though they are like the minuscule fraction of all the plastic that ends up in the oceans screwing with sea life. But is there been an example, I guess, where dramatization has been a clear net positive? Over dramatization.
I mean, I think the turtle example, that wasn't necessarily an it was true, right? What would have been an over-dramatization if they'd like stuck the plastic straw up the turtle's nose and then tried to take a picture? That would have been fake. That would have been fake.
True, faking it, yeah.
False. But I think that the risk of over-dramatization, and I think this is especially true, like for me as a scientist, the risk is that there's a backfire effect later, right? There's the risk is that you erode people's trust in the science, and people need to trust the science to act, right? People only act on climate change because they trust that climate scientists are being honest and telling the truth and are honest about the risks. And if they later find out that these risks have been exaggerated, and there's examples like, I don't know, well, the world doesn't end in 2025, then they turn around and say, but we've been lied to, and we erode that trust. Now, it's usually not climate scientists that are exaggerating. It's like often the media or particular kind of activist spokespeople that tend to exaggerate. But I think that often falls on the scientists, because they'll often put in front of the headline, scientists say, and then they say something that science hasn't actually said. I think that for me, that's the big risk. And I really try to like not stray over that line. I mean, for many of these problems, like Like the truth is bad enough, right? The climate trajectory we're on and the potential impacts are devastating and horrific, and we actually don't need to exaggerate and say that humanity is going to go completely extinct in order to get clicks or attention.
What, if you could like wave a magic wand, would you get the environmental movement to do differently in terms of their framing of narratives? Say, for example, like if you could have Greta Thunberg in front of you, who is obviously an immensely powerful figure. She's got a huge number of people listening to her. She gets invited to all the biggest things. She's essentially become a household name. What messaging, what advice would you give her to improve her messaging?
I mean, I should say that, like, I think Greta Thunberg's done an amazing job. Like, I think she actually really has galvanized eyes on the problem and has like massively raised awareness. I think like she's done really well. I think the overall message that I'd want environmental activists to promote more is stating what we want, not what we don't want. I think there's often the message, it's often a kind of negative framing of we don't want this is bad, stop this. And actually, I think when you look at survey data on messaging that galvanizes people more, is about the promotion of what we actually do want, right? So rather than stop fossil fuels, we're for clean energy.
Yes.
And I think that's the type of messaging. We want to promote the world we want to move to, rather than focusing on the really bad world that we have today. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one is just a more positive message, and people can envision a better future based on that. But there's also this like notion of bringing in the co-benefits of the solutions that we want, right? So just trying to get people to act purely on the basis of climate just won't work, right? It needs to be aligned with other incentives like energy costs, like energy security, like employment, and stating all of those like more near-term co-benefits galvanizes action and interest much more than just we should do this for long-term climate action.
Yeah, so basically more carrot, less stick in terms of an incentive
exactly.
strategy. Yeah, I completely agree. One of the ideas that is being frequently pushed by some aspects of the environmental movement are those of that we need to, is about degrowth, is that we have to consume less, use less energy, use less materials. And on top of that, they even in some ways sort of push for we need to reduce the population. We just have to reduce the pressures. What's your opinion on those kind of mitigations?
Usually well-intentioned, but won't work and won't get votes. Like I think if you're to take the lens of in rich countries, we need to just shrink the economy, shrink energy use, shrink material use. I think if that's the message that a politician is going to come to the ballot with, they won't get voted in. And I think that's the risk. I think what's really key about this is like the time frame that we're talking about, where this is stuff we need to. I mean, we should have been working on it 20 years ago, but, we really, like this decade in particular, we really need to get going on this. So the amount of time that it would take for a politician to, to decide they're going to run on this premise, for people to then buy into that, to vote for them, like you're talking about a really long time before I can see us getting to that state. And you would need this to happen across so many different countries, right? This wouldn't just be like a one country model. It would really need like really wide action. So I think for me, like it's just really politically unfeasible in the timeframes that we're talking about. I think what's really key for me, and I think is often missed in these debates, is that like I agree we need to reduce energy use and we need to reduce material use. I think what's really fundamental and often missed is that when we're talking about the energy transition, we will reduce energy use and we will reduce material use while providing people with the same energy services. And by energy services, I mean the heating, the driving from A to B, the lighting, like all of the stuff that actually provides you with useful energy. You will get the same amount of that, but the energy use at the top of the chain, which we currently produce from fossil fuels, will go down massively. And this is just the result of decarbonisation and electrification. We will reduce energy use and we will reduce material use. And actually you achieve that with zero behaviour change or economic change whatsoever.
And that's
now you can add a layer of that and say we should also do some behavior change. Okay, that's fine, and we can try to do that, but we will still see a drop regardless of behavior change.
So why is that? Is that because of increased efficiency through technology?
Yeah, so there's two key parts to it. So the really fundamental ones, if you look at a flow of the energy system as it is today, so like the fossil fuels we're burning, where that flows to, nearly all of the fossil fuels we burn today are wasted, right? Most of it is waste, and actually only a small fraction of it, and like talking about like a third, actually goes towards providing us with energy services. When we move to low carbon energy, most of that waste will go. That we will basically take that waste out of the system, which means that to provide the same amount of energy services, you just need much, much less energy. Now, there's another step to that where we would often framed as electrification as efficiency. So one of the key things of moving to a low carbon economy is that we need to electrify as many sectors as we can. So like road transport, for example, we need to shift from petrol cars to electric cars. Now, when you break down the maths of that transition, currently, for every dollar of petrol you put into your car, only 20 cents of it actually moves the car, right? 80 cents is wasted. It's like of no use to you whatsoever.
Just through heat and the inefficiency of the engine.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, when you switch to an electric car, it's almost the opposite, right? So for every cent of electricity you put in, only 20 cents is wasted and 80 cents goes towards moving you from A to B, which means for you to drive the same distance in an electric car, you use these 3 to 4 times less energy. So you start to see these massive efficiency gains through electrification. Now, the amount of distance you've traveled hasn't changed. You can drive the same distance, but you're using 3 to 4 times less energy.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear the kind of energy efficiency gains we're not only seeing in things like cars and batteries, but all kinds of different household appliances, certainly since like the 50s and 60s when these things were first made. But at the same time, there is this thing called the Jevon's paradox, which I'd like to talk about, and I'll try and define it now. It's basically that throughout history, we've seen this phenomenon that when energy efficiency of some piece of technology improves, the total net amount of energy that technology ends up consuming across a population either stays the same or in some cases even increases, because as it becomes more efficient, the costs to use it go down, which means more people can use it. So any savings in energy get nullified because now more and more people come online effectively to use that object. And some people argue, and there's this particular YouTube researcher I like, who I think makes a compelling argument for this. His name is Nate Hagans, that market forces will always cancel out any energy savings made through improvements in efficiency because our current economic system is so intertwined with and dependent on GDP growth, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So I think, the Jevon's paradox thing is quite complex. I think there's several dimensions to it. I think one issue I often have with that argument is that actually what people are saying when they're saying that is that people getting access to more energy services is bad, right? If you just break down the fundamentals of what energy efficiency is, you're providing people with more energy services with less or the same amount of energy, right? You can say, okay, they'll use it more, so you get a rebound, what we call a rebound effect. So actually your energy use doesn't go down. Okay, but you've provided them with more energy services. Actually, where this kind of rebound effect or potential, what we call backfire effect, is when it's actually over 100%. So you don't just like lose a bit of the energy gains, you actually increase. This tends to be strongest at the lowest incomes and where people are actually in energy poverty. And with that efficiency gain, you're actually letting them just get access to basic energy services that we take for granted, like being able to afford heating in their home or having more efficient lighting. So I think we often like paint this as it's really bad that this is happening, but like it's actually just giving people essential energy services that massively improve their lives. I think there are several dimensions to the Jevons paradox. There's what we call like the direct rebound effect, which is like looking at that particular item. So if you take the example of lighting, okay, if you get more energy efficient light bulbs, you'd assume, yeah, okay, just energy use will obviously go down, but people might keep the lights on more, or they might install more lights. That direct rebound effect tends to be quite small, right? You're not talking about, they use it 100% and more. It's usually like between like 5 and 30%. Like if you just think about it in your own home, like when you get massively more efficient light bulbs, you don't just like install as many light bulbs as you can until you run out of money to pay for them, right? There's a limit to how much light you actually need. And it's the same, for example, driving a car, right? If petrol costs go down, you might drive your car a little bit more, but there's a limit to how much you actually need to drive. So that rebound effect is rarely over 100%. You lose some of the efficiency gains, but you don't lose all of them. Like if you take the example of the International Energy Agency kind of maps out scenarios to 2050 of what it thinks the energy system will do. It has this kind of net zero scenario where they go through this transition where we try to massively reduce our carbon emissions. Now, baked into that model is people across the world are getting richer, the population is increasing, all of the stuff that is likely to happen. If you look at what happens in that scenario to road transport energy use, the number of global miles traveled doubles, right? So this is maybe this effect that you're describing, right? People get richer, cars get more efficient, we double the amount of miles globally that we're driving. The amount of energy used in the road transport still halves, right? You might not get the 4x decline, but you get a halving because of these efficiency gains.
Actually, yeah, so that brings us to the topic of climate change, because Elon Musk recently tweeted, the only action needed to solve climate change is a carbon tax. And my instinct was like, oh, that can't be sufficient. But actually, if we think through what you've sort of suggested, that would be the way of, if it was some kind of progressive tax, whereby you're not, if you could like scale it so that the people who are producing the most carbon pay proportionally a lot more than, basically make it not linear. I could see that being a way that would basically create the sufficient incentive structures to reduce the worst offenders without also harming the poorest people who need to basically, to lift themselves out of poverty. Would you agree with his statement?
Probably not 100%. Like, I mean, I think like carbon tax is like one of the strongest levers we have. I mean, the problem with climate change is fundamentally that the cost that we pay for energy and fossil fuels is just not reflective of the true cost, right? It doesn't take into account the externalities, which are like environmental and social. And the point of a carbon tax is that you would start to like fully integrate the costs of burning fossil fuels into the price that you pay on the market. And the aim there is that you basically try to rebalance it so you're more economically incentivized to go for the low carbon stuff than you are the high carbon stuff. I think implementing that would be like a really strong political challenge. And I think how you do it in a way that doesn't penalize those at the lowest incomes would be really fundamental. Like you need to do like really strong redistribution, like redistributing the gains from high carbon emitters down to low carbon emitters so that they can still, afford energy and increase living standards. I mean, a carbon tax would definitely work. I think just the political nature of it would be very difficult.
So what do you think the most promising solutions to climate change should be then, if a tax is actually just never going to politically happen?
I mean, some countries do have some carbon taxes on some sectors, and there's carbon trading schemes, so it's not like completely unfeasible. It's just like setting a very high carbon price is difficult, and doing it like economy-wide, like international scale, is difficult. I mean, it fundamentally comes back down to the the price differential between fossil fuels and the low carbon energy sources that you want, right? So if you're not going to implement a carbon tax and make them more expensive, your low carbon sources need to be much cheaper. I think what's really positive about these low carbon technologies is they have got a lot cheaper, right? Over the last decade in particular, like the costs have just plummeted. Like you're talking about a like 90+% reduction in solar, like 70+ in wind, 90+ in batteries, such that the economics of these solutions are just like fundamentally different from a decade ago, right? Like I was sitting a decade ago thinking like, how on earth will we ever tackle this? Because our low carbon technologies are just way more expensive than fossil fuels and people will never pay for them. Like we're in a completely different position today where they're like at least competitive with fossil fuels and in many cases cheaper than fossil fuels. So I think ultimately, based on the pure economics, like the energy transition will happen and it could happen on its own. I think where policy comes in, where we need to shift the needle is like the speed, right? Like we don't have a century for these market forces to play out and for us to finally get there. Like it's how do we use policy and other levers to accelerate that process so that we manage to do it in decades?
Right. Till the last year, I was fairly chill on climate change just because, as you say, it's like the market forces are moving so much in the right direction that it seems like it will be inevitability that we will switch over. And yes, we will have some warming, but its downsides are going to be likely capped. However, I don't know whether it's just the Twitter algorithm has figured out how to wind my brain up the most or something, but in my feed regularly are some climate scientists who are posting images or graphs of the latest ocean temperatures over the last year. And it seems like they're going absolutely crazy. I mean, that even like 4, 5, even 6 standard deviations right now, the current ocean temperatures are above, I think, the 1982 to 2011 mean. That seems absolutely terrifying. How concerned are you about those? Like, are we seeing something that was outside of our predicted models?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always concerned, and I think over the last year, I'd say, I've become like even more concerned. I think it's important to look at like the drivers of the change over the last year. Like last year was a very anomalous year in terms of temperature. Like I mean, every year, like nearly every year, it's, the warmest year on record. So like, that's not surprising, but the size of the anomaly was quite surprising. Now, if you look at the projected models, there is a range and you get like variability year to year. So you never expect a completely straight line. Like last year just snuck in the model. So it is within the kind of model range, but it's like very much on the line. I think there are a couple of potential drivers last year. I mean, the fundamental driver is always the baseline is, human-caused climate change, but you do get fluctuations year to year for various reasons. The really fundamental one last year was the transition to what we call the El Nino. So there are kind of natural climate patterns that called the ENSO, which flips from a kind of cool La Nina phase into a warm El Nino phase. So in an El Nino years, we tend to get warmer temperatures. Last year was quite anomalous because we had what we called a triple dip La Nina event. So like the cooling phase, we had 3 years in a row where it was in that La Nina phase, which means you basically get lots of heat being stored in the surface of the ocean. And then what we had was a very, very sudden flip into the El Nino phase. So that heat then comes pouring out, and it comes pouring out pretty quickly. You normally have, between a La Nina and an El Nino, you usually have what we call a neutral year, or like at least some neutral months, which kind of mitigates a bit of the like sudden outpouring of the heat from the ocean. We didn't have that last year, which is why you saw a very, very fast like increase in the anomaly of the temperature. There are like other hypotheses that I think like still need to be tested. Like there was an underwater volcano. I think probably the impacts of that were quite small. There's like the impacts of like sulfur, reduction of sulfur dioxide.
Right, I was going to ask about emissions. That. Yeah, because it was 2019 or 20 that this new law kicked in that basically reduced the number of sulfur particles that shipping released, right? They changed the fuel source of ships. And that might have inadvertently created that sulfur was essentially creating, was it a reflective layer in the atmosphere, preventing heat from being absorbed? And now we've actually removed that, so we've unintentionally worsened. But while we were trying to reduce like acid rain, we worsened climate change. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's what we call the aerosol effect. So aerosols tend to reflect more sunlight, so they actually like reduce warming a bit. So we've had this kind of balance of, we've got climate change, and we've had, when we burn coal, another fossil fuel, we tend to get sulfur dioxide, which is an aerosol, and it has this reflective impact. So what we've had is this balance of, we've had warming, and some of that has been dampened by the fact that we've got the sulfur dioxide. Now, it wasn't just like since 2019, like for decades, we've been reducing sulfur dioxide emissions because it causes acid rain and it's bad for human health. It has had the inadvertent impact that you take away that kind of masking of some of the warming. Now, we know this, and scientists know this, and it's baked into their models. But there was this fundamental shift in 2019 or 2020 where the shipping regulations were changed. And you saw quite a stark reduction in sulfur dioxide from that source. There's still lots of debate of, we think that it could have quite a significant impact on that local area of warming. But from the studies that I've seen, the impact on globally on temperatures seems to be quite small, and like wouldn't in any way, make up that massive anomaly that we saw last year. So I think that's still a very like highly debated area. So I think there's a couple of potential hypotheses about why last year was so anomalous. I think the next few years will be interesting. And I say that in a quite worried way, but I think it will take a few years for us to see now how temperatures evolve, whether it does cool back down, which we would expect it to after this El Nino event, and trying to work out what those contributions of those different drivers were.
How concerned are you about potential feedback loops being kicked off because of this sudden extreme jump in warming?
I mean, some feedback loops are like already in action, like albedo type 1s are already in action. They're just not a massive driver compared to our emissions of greenhouse gases. So they're fairly minimal at the moment. I mean, there are a couple of, feedback loops and tipping points that we know they're there. We just don't know where in the climate system they are. Like, we might have some idea of, these are ones between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Some of the bigger ones we expect are probably beyond 2 degrees. So there's always the risk that we do tip some of these. I think there's a bit of nuance to that many of the ones that we think are near term, while they would increase temperatures somewhat, it wouldn't lead to this like runaway warming where we go from like 1.5 degrees to like 5 degrees within a few decades. Like some of the kind of feedback looks or tipping points we're looking at, like the disappearance of Arctic sea ice, for example, which would have really devastating like local ecosystem impacts and impacts on local communities. But we think that, the Arctic being ice-free in the summer would like increase warming by like 0.1, 0.15 degrees Celsius. Right, so you go from like 0.6 to 0.7.
Okay.
Now you could have several of these between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and you could end up with like an increase of 0.3 or 0.4 degrees, which is like really pretty bad. But there's a bit of nuance there that, that's probably what we're talking about, rather than we get this runaway warming to 5 degrees within a decade.
Phew. Okay, I'm very glad to hear that, because again, looking into this, it made me wonder about. Because right now our current sort of mitigation solutions are obviously reducing emissions, transitioning to cleaner energy. But there are also more active solutions such as direct carbon capture. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the different methods that are being, what you think, which methods have most promise there. But then also beyond that, you have the slightly more extreme geoengineering potential solutions, such as like managing actual solar radiation by, for example, putting some kind of or at least net reflecting aerosol into the atmosphere, You could even, like really more extreme stuff, do something in space, whether it's some kind of like semi-transparent shade and so on. So I'm curious what your current thoughts are on the most promising developments in terms of solution technologies.
So I think my first and foremost is let's decarbonize the economy as quickly as we can and as massively as we can. I think when we're talking about any of the other solutions, they're like second to that. And the fundamental, and they shouldn't in any way take away from the need to do that. I think people always talk about this kind of moral hazard. I think I'm not that convinced by the moral hazard argument of some of these other technologies. But I think there is like the small risk that, we just look at that and we forget about the decarbonization part. And that should be like our fundamental driver, not just to tackle climate change, which is obviously fundamental, but for the other benefits that come with it, like reduced air pollution, the energy security, like more stable energy systems, etc. But I think I try to also be realistic that we could need some of those other solutions, like carbon. I think with often carbon capture is often like chucked in with carbon removal, and they're actually quite fundamentally different. Like the way I see like carbon capture is like more of like a point source technology where you're like capturing it from a power plant and like sticking
before
it
goes into the atmosphere, as opposed to sucking it back out.
Exactly. I mean, like that could actually be a massive solution, and actually, we could actually fundamentally do that if we wanted to. I think just the incentives are not there. Like if you look at, fossil fuel profits, if they invested that in carbon capture and storage, they could be capturing a lot of that carbon. I think it's just like quite unrealistic to expect that that's ever going to happen. So I kind of see that as I'm just going to have to go around that rather than trying to force that solution. But I think carbon removal, if you look at any of the scenarios we look at out to 2050 or any of the kind of net zero scenarios, there is a chunk of there that's carbon removal, which is basically sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. And this is primarily because there are some sectors for which we think we don't really have the decarbonization technology yet, like plastics or, aviation is possibly one where we don't know if we'll have that tech by 2050. And therefore, if you wanted to reach net zero, you would still have some residual emissions, and you would need to offset that with carbon removal. I think we will need some of that, and I think we should be investing some money in trying to make sure that technology is there. I mean, when we're talking about the quantities that we can currently remove today, I think it's absolutely tiny. It's like basically a non-solution right now, but I think we should be investing some in it to get there. But I should be clear that the carbon reductions we need, we're still talking about 80-90% from where we are today. It's just like looking at how do we get that last 10%. And then geoengineering is, that's another kettle of fish. Like I think there are massive risks to geoengineering. I think the risks are that we don't know. We don't know what the impacts actually would be to many of these technologies. I mean, the issue there, or the concern there, is that you play havoc with rainfall patterns and different weather patterns across the world. And actually, once you start doing that, it's really difficult to not do that without calling what we have like a termination shock. And I think that could be really fundamental. I think there will also be a kind of like weird attribution issue there where we know that we are causing damage on other countries across the world with our carbon emissions today, but we're often not like given the receipts for it. Like there's often not the like, you're to blame for this. I think with many of the geoengineering techniques, it will just be more obvious. We've done this. This has been the impact on this country immediately as a result. Therefore, that's that direct attribution. So I think that's also a geopolitical danger. I would still be putting some funds into doing this, fundamentally to understand what the risks are. If there is like at some point where we're like, this is just like we need to do something. We really don't want to roll the dice in the climate system. We need to do something, and we'll choose to do this. And I think the final reason why I'd be interested in funding some more research into it is that I think there's the geopolitical risk that at some point a country will just decide we've had enough and we'll just do it ourselves.
Right.
Like, you can actually do this stuff pretty cheaply. And I think the threshold that different countries would have for wanting to stop warming are very, very different.
Yes.
So you might get the case where just a country that's just a very high risk of climate, you know, there's a climate disaster, they can see it.
Bangladesh.
Like, we've had enough of this.
Flooded, yeah.
We're going to do it. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think the risk there is that we don't know what that global impact would be. So I'd rather we had like a little bit of an insight into what that climate system afterwards would look like.
Pivoting more to solutions more generally because I mean, there's so many different categories of environmental issues, right? You've got obviously the climate change issue, and then the wider atmospheric pollution. But you've also got more land-based environmental issues like deforestation, microplastics in the ocean. What else we got? There's so many of them. Biodiversity loss. Is there one particular intervention or change in the way we do human, basically, that would solve a lot of these issues at once? What's the most low-hanging fruit out there?
I mean, I think away from climate change, when you're talking about most of those other problems, probably not plastic. Like, the lowest hanging fruit is like eating less meat.
Why?
Basically, all of the environmental problems except climate and maybe air pollution and plastics, when you're talking about water use, land use, biodiversity loss, deforestation, water pollution, you're talking about food systems. And when you're trying to break down the impact of different foods within the food systems, meat is always much higher impact than plant-based foods. So moving from a more meat-dominant diet to a more plant-based diet, like, would tackle 5 or 6 massive environmental problems at the one time.
So, I mean, this comes back kind of to this tension between letting technology solve problems and requiring us to actually have behavior change. And again, I mean, when it comes to the topic of changing people's diets, asking people to eat less meat, that just doesn't seem likely to happen, or at least not likely to happen without immense and understandable pushback from people, because you're essentially changing. Any kind of sort of top-down centralized solution would be, by definition, incredibly draconian. So how do we manage that tension? So, for example, like, that's why I interviewed in a recent episode Uma Valetti of Upside Foods, which is trying to provide a kind of win-win solution to this tension. It's like, people don't want to stop eating meat. People want that protein. They want real animal protein. But at the same time, if current trends continue, where more and more people demand a sort of a US level access to meat, particularly beef and so on, it's going to be utterly unsustainable for the climate. And so doing cultivated meat, lab grown meat essentially, is one way of like balancing that equation. Is there another, because even that, like, I tweeted it yesterday, that documentary, and people are still like, I'm not eating that, like that Frankenfood stuff. Is there another way that is win-win that gives people, like, is it possible to achieve that through more sustainable farming practices, I guess is my question.
No.
Okay.
I mean, what's very clear is that if everyone in the world was to eat the average diet of an American, like, we just physically wouldn't have enough land. Like, even if you cut down all of the forest, use all the grassland, like, we would not have enough land for people to have the diet of the average person in the US. So dietary change at a global level is just like completely fundamental. But I also get this tension, and I should like say that I think I'm more pessimistic on this than I am on energy, because I think behavior change on food is like so hard. Mm-hmm. It's like such a core part of people's identity. It relates to their health. Like, people do not want to be told what to eat, and I think that's going to be the real political challenge here. I think previously I was probably a little bit naive and would think that if we just had like some good kind of meat substitutes, people would see that, they're pretty good and pretty tasty and they'd switch. And, we're just not seeing that. Like you're maybe seeing some shift at the margins. But you're just like seeing nowhere near the scale or the speed of change that you would need. Right. Therefore, like I'm very much now in the camp of, I actually just think we'll need to produce meat, but like without the cow or without the chicken, which is like very much leans towards like cultivated meat. Like you could argue that like massive gains in the quality and reductions in price and like the non-cultured meat substitutes might get you a bit of the way there, but I don't see it getting us all the way there. So I think that's fundamentally where we need to get to. There's the obvious question of what do we do in the meantime, because that process will take some time. And I think, sure, there's the role there for trying to optimize for the most efficient and least environmentally damaging farming there. Like, I think it would be like naive of me to say we should only focus on the like moving people away from meat and not do anything on trying to reduce the environmental impact of the meat that we do have. Like there are lots of potential there. Like there are really large differences in the efficiency of meat production across the world and the environmental impacts. So there's definitely room for us that being part of the equation to get us there. But I think the end point needs to still be a significant reduction in global meat demand.
One of the things you mentioned in your book is that you think one of the most overlooked environmental problems, or at least an area of maximum potential for improvement, is increasing sub-Saharan food production, specifically crop yields. Can you explain why you think that has so much promise?
Yeah, so one of the massive gains that we've seen over the last 50 years or so has been just a dramatic increase in crop yields across the world. So when you were looking back in the 1970s or 1980s, the Paul R. Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb, it was around the time we know there was just like really wide concerns that we're going to have widespread famine, like population growth was out of control. We just wouldn't be able to feed everyone. Today, we have like more food production per person than we had back then. And we've seen massive population growth. And that's really thanks to like massive gains in crop yields. We can produce like 2, 3, 4 times as much food on the same amount of land as we could, 50 years ago. The fundamental problem there is that we've seen massive gains across North America, South America, Europe, Asia. Yields in Africa have increased a bit. It's not that they haven't made any progress, but they're like way, way behind and haven't increased at the rate of other regions. So you're talking about yields in sub-Saharan Africa for cereal crops being like at least half of the global average. And, talking about like 5 times less than many countries or more.
Why is that? Is it the soil? Is it just like poorly implemented techniques?
So some might argue it's just like a biophysical limit and you just can't grow stuff as well in African soils. Like we have a metric which we call attainable yields. And now researchers calculate attainable yields, which is basically the yields you could get with the best current practices and tech that we have available today. Now, the attainable yields for Africa are much higher than the actual yields. So that theory seems to be incorrect. There's not this like biophysical limit that they can't go any higher. I think a lot of it relates to like just fundamental agricultural inputs. So like having access to good seeds that grow well, having access to fertilizers, having access to irrigation, like access to water and rain-fed water is really key across sub-Saharan Africa, and many farmers just don't have irrigation to do that. So it's mostly these kind of technological inputs that are holding yields back. And if we look into the future, like that's the region that we're going to see the most population growth in. Now, there's several issues there compounding. There's like one is the environmental impact of not increasing yields, right? So sub-Saharan Africa will need to produce more food, right? If it doesn't increase yields, it has to use more and more land. Now, that more and more land is going to come from forests. It's going to come from wild grasslands, wild habitat. So you get biodiversity loss and deforestation from an environmental perspective. But there's also like a fundamental human lens where sub-Saharan Africa is the region with like still very high extreme poverty rates. most people there still work in agriculture. So the majority of the population are still working in agriculture, and they earn very, very little. If you do not increase agricultural productivity there, people will be stuck in poverty, and most of the population will be stuck in poverty. So there's the fundamental environmental lens of why increasing crop yield is good, but there's also the fundamental issue of like poverty, food access, and other like socioeconomic gains. I think both of those, like for me, like make this like to me one of the biggest problems we face over the next 50 years.
So I'd love to pivot more to solutions and specifically some past success stories, because it sounds to me like with all of these, well, at least the majority of these environmental problems, the main driver of them is, most people will be familiar with this concept, this Moloch process. I call it the Moloch trap, where basically the short-term incentives, you've got lots and lots of different people sort of competing for some kind of scarce resource, whether it's money, land use, some kind of resource that they can, forest they can cut down and turn into money. Because everyone's competing over this and the incentives are pushing them to do that action, it creates these type of tragedy of the commons type scenarios. And part of the purpose of this podcast is to find ways that we can escape Moloch's trap. So I'd love to hear what you think are examples where we have successfully escaped these kind of coordination dilemmas with the environment.
I mean, I should say that it sounds like, every environmental problem is basically a Moloch trap, right? Like it's hard to actually think of an example
that isn't,
that doesn't fit into that category. It's like, it's just tragedy of the commons. Yeah. And I think the challenge of environmental problems is often the short-term incentives don't line up with the long-term incentives, right? So you're incentivized to degrade the environment in the short term, but often, like, it obviously has long-term consequences. I think there are some success stories. Like, I think the most obvious one, which is just a fundamental coordination problem, was the ozone layer, where we were emitting chlorofluorocarbons, and they were destroying the ozone layer, and we had a massive ozone hole. Now, that was a international problem. That was not a local environmental problem, which means that you had to have global coordination to do so. In some sense, there was really no incentive for a single country to say, okay, we'll switch if the rest of the world wasn't also switching. But that is actually a problem that we solved in the end. Like, we formed the Montreal Protocol. All countries got on board with the Montreal Protocol, and we've reduced the emissions of chlorofluorocarbons by more than 99%. So the ozone hole, like, there's still an ozone hole there, and it will take decades to recover, but really there's nothing more that we can do. Like, we've basically stopped emitting the gases that deplete it, and we basically now just need to wait for it to recover. But that was like very much this kind of Moloch trap where, there was no single incentive for a country to move, but we had to find this global coordination to do so.
So what were the secret ingredients that made this happen? Because it, as you say, like, there wasn't a real obvious short-term incentive. So was it just that there was a small number of countries that were causing the problem and thus the coordination was easier? Or was there something else?
I mean, similar to like greenhouse gas emissions today, there was obviously massive inequalities in the amount of these gases that countries were emitting. So like richer countries were emitting the most and poor countries were contributing very little. I think there was like a couple of really crucial ingredients. I think one was public pressure. So, I mean, the story was actually very similar to climate change in many ways, where initially scientists were like raising the alarm on this and they were getting shut down. Mm-hmm. And, DuPont, who was producing CFCs, was saying, this is nonsense. Especially the American government were saying this is nonsense, and they were ignored for a long time. And a really crucial turning point was the first image we got of the ozone hole. And it was published in the New York Times, and everyone went, oh my God, it's actually happening. And then that's kind of kickstarted this public pressure of, okay, we need to do something about this. But there was another kind of overlap that ended up working really well, which was this interplay between industry action and then governmental action. The story at the time was that DuPont basically had a monopoly on producing chlorofluorocarbons. their patent was about to run out. So they were at risk of losing their monopoly on CFCs. They could quite easily work with the US government to say, we know this now, you know that now this is a problem and you're under pressure to tackle this. We can produce an alternative to this, but you kind of need to set up this political framework that helps us to do so. They then could produce what we call HFCs, which is basically a replacement for chlorofluorocarbons, but without the downsides of depleting the ozone layer. And then they had a monopoly on that. So there was this very much this interplay of, it was in DuPont's favor and industry's favor for this switch to happen. And that could coincide with political action, which was spurred on by public pressure.
Yeah. So once again, you need to have the people who are causing the problems in the first place, you need to offer them some kind of positive financial incentive, or at least lubricate the way for them so that it's very easy for them to switch. Yeah. That seems like a sort of consistent theme throughout this, is that you have these companies that will almost stick their head in the sand, or even put out, like how Exxon there's evidence that they knew that burning oil was causing climate change, and yet they did this whole campaign to completely discredit climate science. And it was a very successful campaign that probably stalled a lot of the interventions that we're now doing by a number of decades. What is the solution to that? Is it more, because arguably, we're in the day and age of boycotts in ways that we never were before. We have the internet that enables people to coordinate and create these big campaigns. Is boycott, should we be leaning more into this idea of public shaming when of big corporations when they do, like Volkswagen? The fact that no one went to jail over the Volkswagen emissions testing scandal is astonishing to me, because that is like a humanity level crime that they did. Same with 3M and the PFAs. I'm not actually that. Yeah, are you familiar with the PFA 3M scandal?
No.
Oh, you're not? Okay. So how I understand it is it was known that PFAs, these forever chemicals, were likely to be basically are impossible to break down. And yet there's growing evidence that they again sort of pushed this issue aside, said that it's fine. And now these chemicals are found everywhere. They're even found in Antarctica. They're in our bodies. We don't really know what the long-term health effects are of them, but it's likely not positive. It's either neutral to negative, maybe very negative. And there seems to be this huge gap in terms of actual criminal repercussions to these companies when they knowingly either greenwashed or cheated. So do you think there's potential? Should we be leaning more into this idea of boycotting and public pressure against these, or does it all just need to become through positive incentive?
I think you're seeing an interesting trend now of climate litigation is becoming a thing, and it wasn't a thing in the past, and actually becoming more successful. So I think there are more successful routes to that. I think the challenge with boycotts is that you do need an alternative to be in its place, right? The fundamental problem that we have is that if you have a petrol car, and you need that petrol car, how can you boycott the oil companies?
Right.
Right. It's very hard for individuals to do that. The only way they can fundamentally do that if there is a better alternative there. So I think, yes, there is room for this negative pressure, but it can't be in a vacuum, right? It needs to be alongside the building of solutions that people can then move to and have the option to move to.
It's interesting as well. You mentioned sounds like a key part of this, the ozone layer success, or at least banning CFCs and switching to a non-ozone destroying alternative, was this image that was on the front page of New York Times. So having some kind of very clear, salient thing that people can go, oh, wow, this is actually a real problem. Because coming back to this topic of food, which sounds like one of these problems that we really don't have a clear solution to right now. And it's a growing problem with meat consumption. So is there some kind of image that could have the same effect of making the public wake up? Because right now people just have their heads in the sand. They think that there's no issue. They always the marketing companies will just show a picture of like a cow in pasture, when the reality is actually there's like just reams of slurry going into rivers, and like in massive amount of environmental degradation. So what would be the equivalent of the ozone hole layer maybe for food?
I think the fundamental challenge with food is that most of us now are like so far away from it, right? Like in the past, like most of us were living on farms and actually growing the food ourselves. And, most of us now don't. And like, you'd be lucky to actually go to a farm or see a farm. I think I'm more coming from the environmental lens, but I'm sure the kind of animal welfare lens would say, like, if you want to eat meat, you go into the slaughterhouse and you see what's happening there, or you actually kill an animal. I think that for many people that would be the kind of like visceral, like, oh God, this is how this system works. And we just don't see that. Like we kind of know peripherally, okay, I'm sure that's how this meat ended up on my plate, but there's like no like tangible connection that we actually see or feel. So I think like it would be more of the experiential, like actually going into a slaughterhouse and seeing the conditions that the animals live in, and also seeing how they're physically slaughtered. Like I think if like a test for people eating meat was like, can you actually kill the animal? Meat consumption would go down a lot.
On the topic of deforestation, one of the key focuses people talk about in terms of reducing the rainforest being cut down is palm oil and how it's a huge problem. But in the book, you actually discuss how that's yet another one of these sort of confused, a topic that people are confused on, and that actually palm oil might be our best current solution in terms of if we boycotted all palm oil, it might actually make deforestation worse. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's kind of a counterintuitive finding. And I should say that in the past, I was very much in the like, palm oil is really bad, let's just boycott it, that's the solution here. I think without downplaying the negative environmental impacts that palm oil has had, I think that's like too simplistic an image of this. I think like to fundamentally start, like palm oil has caused large amounts of deforestation and large amounts of environmental impacts. Like there's no disputing that, especially in Indonesia and Malaysia, where most palm oil was grown. It has led to tropical deforestation and the destruction of really biodiverse habitats. I think the question you have to ask there though is, if we weren't producing that vegetable oil from palm oil, what would the alternative be? And would the alternative scenario there be better? Now, what's possibly fantastic, but also the downfall of palm oil is that it's a really, really productive crop. Like you get really, really high yields per hectare. Now, if you compare it to other vegetable oil crops, you're talking about to the extent of like 5 to 10 times more oil per hectare than some of the other crops, especially some of the other tropical crops. Now, what that fundamentally means is if you were to boycott palm oil and the amount of vegetable oil demand stayed the same, you would have to replace that with something else. And if you were replacing it with any of the other oils, you would need to use a lot more land to produce the same amount. Depending on where you produce that and what crop you select, that could lead to more deforestation and more environmental damage than we're currently seeing for palm oil. So I think this approach of just completely boycott palm oil, we'll just produce it from something else, I think is too simplistic. I think really the message there is, if palm oil is a really productive crop, and in some sense a land-sparing crop, the fundamental problem is there, can we produce palm oil in a way that doesn't lead to more deforestation while we also harness the benefits of its productivity? So that leads you more towards solutions like there's like the RSPO, which is like the round table of, I think, responsible production or something like what the acronym is. But it's more focused on, can you get palm oil producers certified to make sure this hasn't been grown on deforested land, it's not causing more deforestation and destruction. And for me, that's like probably a more effective approach than just boycotting it and saying we won't use any of it anymore.
Yeah, so it sounds like in many of these cases, we do need bottom up incentive drivers, and coming from the population driving political will. Ultimately, we need more, at least a certain degree of smarter top-down regulatory solutions. Are there any cases where regulation is a clear non-starter? Because I'm currently in the weeds, in the trenches on Twitter of talking about the AI safety problem, right? And this is one where there's a lot of people saying that regulation is basically always harmful, because it gets co-opted, it creates regulatory capture, it opens up the risk for tyranny and so on. And I imagine that maps quite well onto some of the pushback for the environmental movement as well, because it feels like in many ways, a lot of these culture wars we see is ultimately, if you boil it down, it's between people who want to, who think that the solution to these problems is to decentralize power, reduce the amount of top-down control, and people who believe that the only solution are top-down. We need more sort of centralized governance and top-down control. So I'm curious whether there are any instances within the environmental movement, and I suspect that with environmental cases, because they're tragedy of the commons, top-down coordination is kind of like some kind of incentive structures that enable us to coordinate, which usually come from on high, are the better solution. So are there any cases where that's not the case, clearly?
I think it depends on whether you want an optimal solution or a solution that might be realistic and get you some of the way there. I think you can even look at the history of global climate agreements, and you can see this very, very clearly. We used to be in a process where it was top down. So the way that these climate negotiations used to work was that rich countries, which totally valid, historically have emitted the most and were the biggest emitters, the responsibility was on them to reduce emissions, quite rightly. But you ended up with a framework that was top down, and would basically impose this on rich countries. And other countries actually didn't have any really obligation to try to reduce emissions or have any targets in place. And this top down approach really didn't work. What was so, I think, pivotal about the transition to the Paris Agreement is that it was bottom up, right? There wasn't this top down target of globally we will say what countries have to do. It was this bottom up approach of countries have to come to the table and say this is what we're willing to do. Now, I think that's actually really crucial in getting a global agreement, right? I don't think China or India or many other countries would have accepted this top down approach of globally, but also rich countries saying this is what we expect of you, you have to do this, even though we have fundamentally caused the problem historically. That just wouldn't have worked. But the bottom-up approach did work. There are some downsides to that in that we might have got an agreement, but the position we're in today is that the targets are too loose. Now, what was agreed with the Paris Agreement is this, what we call ratcheting up approach, where we knew that the initial commitments on the table were too weak, and governments were supposed to ratchet them up over time and make them more and more ambitious. So we eventually got to the stage where they were actually in line with what we need to do for carbon and climate targets. We're currently falling short of that because governments aren't bringing strong enough policies to the table yet. So there's two edges to that sword. One is that, the bottom up approach actually allowed us to get an agreement and allowed people to get around the table. The downside is that with the bottom up approach, it doesn't necessarily lead you to the optimal outcome, which you would say if you had a top-down global level, if you just told everyone you have to do this and they achieved it, you could get to that final number that you needed in 2050. But that's not how it pans out from the bottom-up approach.
Pivoting back to our world in data, what's the most surprising fact you've personally found while you were working as a data scientist?
Oh, that's a good question. We have a lot of statistics on the site across a really broad range of topics. I mean, I think for me, the statistics around the food stuff. Like I actually didn't know coming into this. And actually, like I think like fundamental for my journey has been I kind of had a scientific understanding of environmental science, but actually didn't know like the high level numbers. Like I didn't know how much land we were using for agriculture or what the differences between different products were. Or so I think like actually putting numbers on those was surprising. I think some of the most surprising numbers recently have been around reductions in air pollution in given countries and how quickly some of these solutions are coming through. Like I think China is a very clear example where I'm just like always blown away by the latest numbers from China's like energy system. Like one is just the dramatic reductions in air pollution over the last decade. And it's just like really, really quickly.
Like what sort of numbers are we talking here?
So if you're looking at like reductions in local air pollution, like you're talking about cuts of, 2/3 within like 7 years. Yeah, it's been really, really fast.
And what's been the main driver of that change?
So like I cover in the book the story of Beijing, where like Beijing's air pollution levels have fallen like really quickly and really dramatically. And again, the story there is like sort of ended up coming from public pressure. So Beijing hosted the 2008 Olympics, and at the time, it was extremely polluted. Like China's cities were extremely polluted. The Chinese government obviously realized, oh God, like everyone in the world is going to be looking at us at the Olympics, and athletes are going to be competing in this like world stage. We better try to like reduce the local air pollution levels. So they brought in a lot of like quick term measures and actually did reduce air pollution levels quite a bit. It was still like I think one of the most polluted Olympics ever, but it was actually fundamentally much lower than the levels before that. The issue is that then when the athletes went home and the world stopped watching, the pollution levels came back. Several years on, and citizens in Beijing, kind of realized, okay, you can actually reduce the pollution levels because we did it for the Olympics. Why are we putting up with this on a day-to-day basis? Like we're actually like chopping years off our lives with this level of pollution. And there was like really strong political pressure, like even in the media, to get like air quality, even just measurements in place so people can see the air pollution levels. And there was this fundamental drive to reduce air pollution levels. And it's been like really, really effective. And actually the estimates there are like citizens of Beijing have like increased life expectancy. You're talking about like 4 years or more from these massive reductions in air pollution.
And that's the thing, again, what people often don't appreciate is that it helps grow their economy fast. In the long run, that's going to pay off dividends, having your population healthier and more able to work. People often lose sight. You've got, again, the short-term incentives of like, well, if we don't let these factories pollute, then we're taking a hit to our GDP. But it's these hidden costs, long-term costs that actually are often presumably much larger. Have you tried to how would you go about trying to calculate the increased benefit, for example, for having the citizens of Beijing live for an additional 4 years? Is that something that would be calculable?
Yeah, it's difficult, but some researchers do it. I mean, the opposite way to do that is to like calculate what's the economic cost of air pollution. And that comes from various ways. It comes from like health impacts. It comes from like productivity impacts. It can come from just like disruptions in a city if it's really polluted. And actually in less so in high income countries because we've massively reduced our levels of air pollution. But in middle and low income countries, you're talking about several percentage points of GDP, like and actually more in some countries that are much more polluted. But of course, like that's just like not the economic cost that we necessarily see, and we don't really see it on the balance sheet because it's an alternate reality of like what would be like without air pollution. But like that's obviously a counterfactual, so we just don't see it. But the economic costs are like pretty high.
Pivoting away from the environment, one section you have on World in Data is about the rates of war and conflict on Earth. And sort of intuitively, again, if you're following the news closely, it feels like we're trending towards more conflict and war. The world certainly feels a bit more hostile than it did, let's say, 5-10 years ago. Does your data back that feeling? And if it doesn't, what are the mechanisms you think that have basically created this disconnect?
I mean, I should caveat this initially by saying this is like really not my area of expertise, and like you'd probably be better to speak to someone else in our data on this. I mean, I think if you're looking at the longer term trends on conflict and war, and like beyond that to like long term violence. So if you also look at like homicide rates, like there is an overall general trend downwards. I think with conflict and war, what's really crucial is there is this like volatility to it. So it's not this like linear downward trend. There is like an overall downward trend, but you obviously get these fluctuations and this volatility in the system. I don't actually know what the latest figures look like in that overall trend. I mean, I would guess it would be elevated relative to previous years, but I think the overall trend to some extent is downward. I think the flip side of that is that even if the actual trends playing out are downwards, you could quite easily argue that the risk of conflict and very, very large scale conflict is arguably like as high as it's ever been. So there's a dimension of what's actually going on and what you might project as future risk.
And is that because of technology? Or
I mean, technology, fundamentally just people having nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenal, and how that plays out in geopolitics. I think there's just like fundamental risk there that you could argue we've had that over the last 50 years or so, and that's always been there. But prior to that, that risk wasn't as high as it is now. I think that's the overall risk in just like looking at like trends and just extrapolating and just saying, like, of course this will continue to go down. Like fundamentally no, and that's not how these volatile risks work.
On the topic of competition, I always like to get a sense of my guests' own personal relationship with it. Would you describe yourself as a competitive person?
I think in the past I was very competitive. Like I've always done a lot of sports. And I think like when I was much younger, like it was very much in a competitive spirit. Like I wanted my team to be winning. I wanted to be the best. I think I definitely had that competitive streak in me. I think I've always had a very strong self-competitiveness. Like I'd say I'm like quite a harsh critic of myself, and I kind of always want to be doing better and better. So I think there's like a very strong like competition critic lens to the stuff that I do. I think like now like person to person competition, I think I've like mellowed a lot, and I wouldn't say on that matter I'm like a very competitive person anymore.
What do you think was the driver of that mellowing? Because I experienced the same thing myself.
I think at some point I had started to have like a fundamental shift from like seeing the world as zero sum. And seeing how important that shift is. Like not when I'm talking about sports, because that's fine, but like a more like broader fundamental level. I think there was just like a flip in my head of like, okay, the world is actually not zero sum, and actually stopping thinking about it in the zero sum way would like really help us to finding solutions to many of these problems. And I think that kind of feeling started to sink in at just a more personal level as well.
Was there a moment where you sort of had a light bulb moment that you can pinpoint, or was it more of a gradual shift?
I think it was a more gradual shift. And I think you then start to also get feedback, like small feedbacks from like personal actions and collaborations. And I mean, you can start to see the benefits of like not viewing yourself as in competition with others, and actually see the benefits of working on this together. And, like I've been really lucky to like have like had amazing mentors and people that would like prop me up. And now I also feel like I should not view other people as this kind of in this competition nature. And I actually, if I prop them up, that also gives them benefits. So I think like you start to then see these kind of personal feedbacks of this is actually moving us forward. And to me, it's also like beneficial. I like collaboration. I like promoting other people. And I think that was a fundamental shift.
How does competition manifest in the data science world, if at all?
I would normally say not at all, but I think that's not true. I think at least in the academic world, there's quite fierce competition, right? Like there's way too many PhDs for academic positions. There's way too many academic positions for tenure. There's this constant fight for, the latest funding, like getting your papers in the latest, like the top journals. So I think actually many aspects of academic research are really highly competitive. I think when it comes to like data science and our own data, I would say what we're now really conscious of, and I want us to continue to do better on this, is like doing better at promoting the underlying data sources and researchers that we rely on. Like our own data would just not be able to do the work that it does if there weren't like tons of amazing people out gathering the data, publishing the data, doing the research. And fundamentally, those should be the people that are getting the credit, not us that are like making a map and putting it on the website. So I think trying to more like in a better way, like highlight who's actually fundamentally doing the work here and making sure that journalists or other sources are crediting them and not necessarily crediting us is really fundamental. I mean, I also know that for them, they're often like pretty small teams, constrained budgets, and actually their work being used in a very public format can possibly do a lot to maintain their funding. So I think for that for on that basis, like I think like highlighting their work is really crucial, and to some extent we want to reduce competition.
Would you say that that sort of data infrastructure, those people are the sort of key bottleneck or area of concern for you in your work at OWID in data?
Not the people producing the data. I think the key bottleneck is like the data gaps where we just don't have data. And actually for many metrics, there are really massive gaps in the world, like primarily in lower income countries where, there's just not what we call the statistical capacity of like, it just costs a lot of money to go around and gather data and like input that into a system. And if you're on a constrained budget, that's just really not your priority. So I think for us, that's like a key constraint of like being able to get the data we need in order to show the metrics that we think are most important to understand the problem.
What does living win-win mean to you?
I mean, I think it comes back to like the sustainability equation that we discussed at the start. Like win-win for me is like being able to provide like a good life for everyone that's on the planet today, but doing so in a way that's environmentally responsible and doesn't take that opportunity away from the generations that come after us and the other species on the planet. And I think the way I frame it in the book is that I don't think that future is inevitable. Like I can't say that this is going to happen, but I think what I wanted to present is like this massive opportunity that we have ahead of us. Like, as I said in the past, I think it's always been win-lose. It's either been like lose for humans or lose for the environment. And I think we're now in this kind of unique position where I can see a future where it actually is win-win. It just, needs us to like get a move on and put it into action.
So what call to action would you give to people listening who are inspired by your work or feel inspired to help contribute to environmental problems?
There are a bunch of amazing solutions already there. It's about implementing them. And I think what's really fundamental to that is really highlighting the non-environmental benefits. I think it's pushing against many of the misconceptions people have about these solutions, which ultimately I think will just delay us over the next few decades if we don't start to try to squash those. So I think it's promoting the solutions that we already have there, not just for the environmental benefits, but for the other stuff that people care about, right? We need to get the short-term incentives lined up with the long-term incentives. And I think they're there. It's just that people don't actually see that these are now aligned because 10 years ago they weren't aligned, but they now are. And then I think there are still problems out there that we just don't have the solutions to. I can see us getting there, but there are like a vacuum of for solutions there now. And I think it really just takes people like saying, this is a problem, I'm going to work on it. And I think there are like some amazing individuals, like I know you've had like Boy and Slat on the show before, where like he was just a guy that saw a problem, like there's plastics in the ocean, there shouldn't be plastics in the ocean, how do I solve this? And I think he's just done like, whether he like fundamentally like succeeds or fails, like I think he's already made a massive positive difference. And it's just from like seeing a problem and being like determined, I'm going to find a solution to this. And I think there are a range of problems today where it just needs people like really high, like really intelligent, really determined people to like go out and try and find solutions.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you.
There we go, everyone. Huge thank you to Hannah for letting me pick into her amazing brain. I mean, I've been a kind of a fangirl of her work for a while. I've been using our world in data, funny enough, for many, many years. It's informed a lot of my thinking. So I'd highly recommend, if you've gotten to this point in the conversation, that you go and take a real just dive of their site. It's not just about environmental stuff, everything economics, politics, rate of change of war. There's also nice things on there too. It's not, again, it's just about trying to get a clearer picture of what's actually going on in our world. If you also want to take a deeper dive into Hannah specifically, I deeply recommend her book. It's not the end of the world. It's so jam-packed with incredible statistics and facts and especially many counterintuitive things that you would not have heard of. If you want something briefer, you can also check out her TED Talk. It's only 13 minutes long, but it really beautifully summarizes like her point about this sustainability equation and how we can balance it and turn it into what seems like a win-lose, a trade-off, into a true win-win. So very apt topic. That's why I was so pleased to have her on here. As always, if you enjoyed this, please tell your friends. Let's keep this win-win whole ball rolling. But either way, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time.